Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luhr, and today we're heading over to Paris to catch up with Professor Simon Chadwick. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Hi, Marcus. Thank you for inviting me to take part.
I'm excited and looking forward to spending the next hour here talking sports, talking academics, and how those two worlds come together. And of course, what you've done in your nearly 30 years, 3 decades here in the industry. But let me just sort of quickly introduce you a little more for people who might not know who you are. So Professor Simon is a researcher, writer, consultant, speaker, and academic. Nearly 30 years of experience in working at business schools across Europe and the world, and of course in the world of sports and international sports. Currently, Simon is the Professor of Sports and Geopolitical Economy at Schema Business School in Paris, and we'll talk about it. But he's also the author of several books, just to mention maybe a few: The Business of FIFA's World Cup, The Handbook of Football Business and Management, one of my favorites here, Sports Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. And of course, it's been featured many times all around the world in articles, magazines as an expert. And the Times of England calls him the guru of sports management in Britain. Here we go. So, on that note, Simon, let's kind of have a look how you got into this, the space you're in now. And, we always like to start right at the beginning. So, give me a sense of, when you were a student yourself. I know you wrote a paper on the Premier League. I think this was during your master, and then of course you did a PhD after. So, but take us back to those days and kick it off there.
I'll take it right back to the very beginning, and when I was 1 year old. My father, actually, I say my father. It was technically my parents, but I suspect it was my father. Bought a house right opposite my local football team's stadium. So this was, in its heyday was 42,000 people. But every day,
which club this is? Where you got to tell us which club this is.
So my team is Middlesbrough, and the stadium was Ayresome Park.
Okay, cool.
So when I was a kid, I lived in Ayresome Park Road from when I was 1 year old.
Nice.
And so every morning when we pulled back the curtains, the first thing that we saw was a football stadium. And when we opened the front door to go to school, I had to walk past the football stadium to get to school.
That's cool.
And so, right from the very start, sport was really important. And I lived in a kind of family where you just watched and played sport, full stop. And that was, again, principally my father, but my grandfather was a huge sports fan. My great-grandfather was a huge sports fan. He was from Leeds, so there was always a bit of tension in the family because he was a Leeds United fan, whereas we were all Middlesbrough fans. Right. But I guess I started off life as somebody who watched lots of sport, played lots of sport, talked about lots of sport. And then I went away to university, and my first degree was economics, and I really enjoyed my economics degree. I think that I studied and thought about and talked about and wrote about lots of interesting things, like transport and houses and this kind of thing. But it never occurred to me at that point that, number one, you could talk about sport in such a way or write about sport in such a way. And it certainly never occurred to me that what somebody like me would do at, kind of 21 years old is, that I would look for a job in sport.
Right.
And it was only really much later on, obviously, I continued to watch sport. I continued to play sport. I'd continued to think about it. But it was only much later on when I got my first university job in the mid-90s, and I shared my office with a guy who ultimately it turned out to have been a former Aston Villa player, and he'd played at kind of under-20s level for the England national team. Mm-hmm. Coincidentally, when he retired, he went to coach the under-19s team in Saudi Arabia, which is an interesting side detail. But I always remember sharing an office with this guy, and he turned to me in my first university. He turned to me in this office and he said, "Should we write a paper on sport?" And yeah, okay. So that's what I did, and together we wrote something on the Premier League, which we delivered at an academic conference in France back in the mid-90s, and as people say, the rest is history.
Yeah. Now I want to go back 1 minute, one question. How old were you when you attended your first Middlesbrough match? Do you vaguely remember, or
Well, there are two occasions when this happened. So the first occasion is when I was 6 years old. They used to open the gate. They used to open the gates up. Keep in mind the games would start at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and by maybe 4:15, when you were in the second half, people maybe needed to leave early. So they started to open the gates up at that time. So I remember playing in the street with my friends, and someone saying, "Let's go in and look." So I remember that we snuck in. We sneaked into the game, and but if you're talking about actually going and going with someone and sitting down or standing up and kind of watching the full 90 minutes, it was when I was 7 years old, and my father took me.
Still really, really awesome. I love it. Great start. So here we are. So you wrote, you created a paper there on the Premier League, and now let's talk a bit about your PhD, because again, you I think your thesis was on football shirt sponsorship and the impact, I guess, around it, and we're now in early 2000 here. Just share a little bit about it. What was it all about, and how you then obviously got into that academic side of it.
I mean, I think that kind of prior to the mid-90s, I worked a little bit in the brewing industry, but not for very long. I decided to go and train as a teacher. And subsequent to that, I then went to work in my first university in Coventry University. This is where I wrote about the Premier League with the former player that I mentioned. He was also an academic at the university. And we wrote about the Premier League in terms of kind of sponsorships and brands and fan engagement and broadcasting rights. And it was really interesting, the first event that we delivered this paper at, this academic conference, because I think 50% of the audience, kind of the response was, what the hell are you talking about? Right. What is this all about, and why are you talking about these kinds of things? And then the other 50% of the audience, it was almost as though we'd performed alchemy. They couldn't quite understand. They couldn't get their heads around this kind of this wonder that we were discussing. So it was a little bit of a kind of uncertain start, because we were not sure whether people were, certainly the academic market, if we put it that way, were receptive to the kinds of ideas that we were sharing. But as time went on through the 90s towards the late 90s, very clearly the Premier League.
Just to interject for a second, if I remember correctly, the Premier League as it is now, right, as a sort of entity we all recognize now, it was only launched around that time, right? So 96, was it?
1992.
92. Okay, so just slightly before. All right, got it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's a great observation, Marcus, because I remember reading around 1990, 1991, there was something called the Blueprint for the Future of Football was published by the English FA, right. And there's a very clear message inside the Blueprint for the Future of Football, which is basically English football could make more money by establishing the Premier League, and so. Right. In those terms, I guess the Premier League passes the test. It was set up to make money, and it's made money. So job done. But but certainly as we got towards the end of the 90s, been writing more about the business of sport for an academic audience. And in the late 1990s, I enrolled to study, as you say, for a PhD, which was at the University of Leeds. Mm-hmm. Essentially, it was a study about football shirt sponsorship, and why do sponsors do it? Why do clubs do it? And what are the kind of key ingredients in terms of establishing successful sports sponsorships? And obviously, at that time, it was a very different sponsorship environment. I remember some of the shirt sponsors were, for instance, there was a trade union was a shirt sponsor. There was a local government office was a shirt sponsor. Obviously alongside beers and financial services products and so forth. Yeah. But
what was the numbers? Do you remember any of sort of what was sort of the shirt size deals at the time when you guys were doing the research?
you're talking about very small deals in some cases. I think
£1 million or less.
well, yeah,
more?
I mean, it was less than £10 million, and I think
for sure.
in some cases, certainly as you move, because the research didn't just focus on the Premier League; it went all the way down the professional league structure.
Okay.
So I looked at all 92 clubs. And,
Right.
and in some cases there were shirt sponsorship deals that were in-kind deals. So they struck an arrangement somehow where they get free shirts, or they get food and beverage services inside the stadium or whatever it might be, in return for the name on the shirt. So it was a very different environment, but obviously what it started to do, because I didn't just talk to the football clubs themselves. I also spent time with sponsors. I spent time with people at Carlsberg, for instance, at organisations like Betfair. Mm-hmm. Essentially interviewing them and asking them, why did you do this? What are you hoping to get out of it? What do you think are the best ways to manage such relationships? And so, out of that, by the early 2000s, came my PhD thesis.
Mm. Now, I'll give you my thesis, which didn't get me a PhD, but this is how I explain, having sold these kind of sponsorship, obviously. The crest, right, which is, the club's crest, sits on the left side of the jersey, right, in pretty much every sports I can think of, which is obviously just above the heart, right? And then the logo, obviously, with the sponsor sits right below. So my simple explanation of any sponsor has ever been, this is the closest thing you get to the heart of the fan. Do you like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well done. You should copyright that one and share it.
Yeah, and I must have said it 100 times probably in my life, but 1,000. And I think I completely believe that's true. There is, this is obviously what the fan is all about, right? He's about that crest there, that symbol of which he recognizes as, which he loves and is close to his heart. And if the minute you put that logo near to it, wherever that maybe is, but, especially when it's right under it, to me, that is the connecting, right? And, I've seen studies, and I don't know whether that was part of what you did as well, is that the fan, the part which is the most interesting, I feel, I always read, is not so much the conscious element of, okay, this is now our sponsor, so, and I like this club, so therefore I should support it, but is the subconsciousness to the message that the fan literally doesn't actually even know how he's getting now stimulated in his brain to like that company, because that is the company which is supporting his club, right, or her club.
Yeah, and there were some interesting elements to my study. I mean, in one particular case, it was Sheffield United. So Sheffield United actually had a company called Desson as their shirt sponsor, and this was a Chinese fruit powder manufacturer. And what this means is this company would sell powders to, for example, supermarket chains across the world, and you add water to the fruit powder and you've got fruit juice.
Right. So know what they do, right?
Yeah, and so nobody really knows what they're doing. But what was really interesting, and when I spoke to the commercial team at Sheffield, and also spoke to some fans too, they really liked what seemed at the time like a very exotic logo with Chinese characters underneath it that nobody really knew. And subsequently, when that deal ended, and I think Sheffield, if I recall correctly, played without a logo on its shirt for some time, is the fans were really quite upset about the fact that there wasn't a sponsor's logo on the shirt. And so I think it is really interesting, because obviously in England sponsorship logos weren't allowed on shirts until quite late, 1978.
All right.
Okay. And there was some resentment towards them, and I guess even now there probably is some resentment, particularly gambling brands. But it is amazing how they've kind of burrowed their sponsor logos, and sponsors have burrowed their ways into the consciousness of fans.
Absolutely.
And so we now do accept the names and logos, and as I say, I think in certain cases we even as fans celebrate some of those logos.
Yeah, for sure. Now let's go a bit deeper here into your space is not just football, although football I think you have done a lot of things, and I want to talk a bit more about it. But I believe you also have been motorsports and cycling and certain other sports, right? You've have an interest, and B, believe you've done work in these areas, right?
So yeah, I mean, my great secret is that when I was younger, there was a time when I actually fell out of love with football and really fell in love with motorsport, and not just with Formula One, but again, right down to, for example, Formula Ford and Formula Renault, really kind of rough, rainy club days at windswept circuits, watching crazy people race around and crash a lot. So I used to be a huge motorsport fan, and I think again, I mentioned my father already. He was a very, very keen cyclist. Mm-hmm. I guess back in the days when cycling was not especially popular in Great Britain. But again, this resulted in me going to watch cyclocross. Most British people typically haven't watched cyclocross, but as a kid, my father would take me to muddy fields to watch cyclocross, and we'd go to velodrome. So so cycling has also been a kind of something of a secret passion of mine as well.
Interesting. Now let's go into sort of the not just the academic side so much, but I'd love to touch a bit on the work you've done with clubs and leagues, etc. around the world. So let's maybe just pick some of your early part of your career after you finish your PhD there. I recall you mentioned before that you did some work with Barcelona. And some of the characters there, of course, are now well known and also moved on into other clubs. So just share a bit about, maybe let's start there with Barcelona, and then maybe we talk a bit about Chadwick, etc.
Yeah, so I as I was finishing my PhD in the early 2000s, I guess the simple thing to say is the world was changing, right? And I found myself in classrooms very often with large numbers of students who weren't British. They weren't even European. In many cases, they were from South Asia, from East Asia. And what struck me about talking to them in my classes was that how passionate they were about sport and about football in particular. And so this ultimately resulted in me working together with master's students and then subsequently with PhD students, mm-hmm. looking at fans in places like China, South Korea, Japan, and elsewhere, and trying to understand, number one, their fandom in terms of their own country. So, which teams they've followed in China, for example, and why, right. But also why they were engaged with overseas teams as well. So why there are Manchester United fans in Beijing, or why there are Bayern Munich fans in Tokyo, and we're talking about really quite big data sets. Talking to, in one particular case, we surveyed 12,000 Chinese fans, right. About their tastes and preferences and the things that they buy in relation to European football clubs. And so,
and what is it? I mean, out of that study, just to state that for a second, what is it, if you summarize it from that study, what makes a Chinese fan pick a club? In the UK, or I'm from Germany, it's obvious, right? It's mostly the city you grew up in, and or your father's club is in that sense, right? If there are more than one club in the city, but how does a Chinese fan, based on the research you guys did, how did they pick it? Really, is it just who wins the Champions League and therefore everyone talks about it, or how do people pick it?
I guess lots of reasons. So one of the things that we observed, and keeping in mind this is in the kind of mid to late 2000s. Sure. We noticed, for instance, in China there were lots of Serie A fans. Okay. And when we started to dig deeper, very often we found that there was an older family member who during the 1980s, obviously was younger, but during the 1980s, as you may know, Marcus, Serie A was the first European league that had its games broadcast live in China, and so during this communist period when there was not a lot else available, lots of people therefore became Serie A fans, and they became Juve fans and Inter Milan fans and AC Milan fans, and of course by the time you fast forward to 2000s, these young people from the 1980s had got married, they'd got kids, and what they were doing is just like you and me, Marcus. They were saying to their kids, you will support Inter Milan and you will support Juventus. Sure. So I think that kind of family influence was there, but if you're thousands of miles away in China and you can pick any European football teams to support, maybe you don't select Middlesbrough, given its image and its reputation and its long history of underachievement. Instead, what you do is you think, mid 2000s United, they're winning, they're winning the league, they're qualifying for the Champions League, they've won the Champions League. Let's be a United fan. So I think it's in some ways it's a lifestyle choice, an entertainment choice. It's a form of conspicuous consumption. As some of the listeners may know, there is this notion of burging, psychological phenomenon of burging, which is basking in reflected glory. So, walking down the main street in Beijing, if you're wearing a Manchester United shirt, you're going to look pretty good. If you're walking down the main street in Beijing wearing a Middlesbrough shirt, maybe you won't look. Maybe you won't look.
You'll
cool,
stick out a bit more, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But obviously, United and Bayern and Real Madrid and Barcelona. So off the back of this, what we started to find was clubs were really interested, because I think there was this kind of post 2002 interest in China in particular, but certainly South Korea and Japan following the World Cup. Yep. And clubs wanted to know more. And I guess back in the day, there wasn't an industry of consultants or advisors or researchers who could tell you, what was happening in downtown Beijing. It was people like me doing academic research. And so I, for instance, went out to Barcelona, met with their international team, talked to them about the research that we'd been doing, provided some insights, and this subsequently led to the vice president and director of finance for Barcelona at the time, Ferran Soriano, eventually coming to the university where I was working, the University of London, to give a talk to students and invited others. I kept his slides that day. I've still got them. He knows that I wrote to him and I said, look, I've still got your slides. But in his presentation, and again, it goes back to what I said earlier about kind of blowing the minds of people and really kind of either completely switching them off or completely switching them on. But that day, Ferran Soriano, I think really, in one sense antagonized people, but in other ways opened the minds of some people to the new possibilities of 21st century sports. He talked about running a football club like Disney and thinking about it in terms of franchises, having different franchise opportunities across the world, merchandising. It was, as I said, this was incredible. I recorded it as well. I've got it on DVD too. I've not just got his slides, I've got it on DVD too. Nice. But of course, Ferran Soriano, as we now know, is the chief executive of City Football Group. Correct. And so many of the things that he talked about back in 2005, 2006 that I first became aware of, you fast forward to now, and obviously he's been able to do a lot of those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that. It's a great story. And I've heard this, so let's say in a sense, I heard this story before, obviously how he had the similar vision already at Barcelona, but obviously couldn't necessarily implement it. And now, you look at City football and that's really what it is, right? And clearly, like you just described it, you were right there at that start. That's very cool. And again, a bit like to answer a little more of what we were talking about earlier, how fans in Asia really get there is, you're right. The media side of it, the TV distribution has always been a huge part. Indonesia is another one of those countries where the Serie A is still doing well and always has a strong following, again, because it was on one of the big broadcasters there. Bundesliga does quite well in China because for years it was free on CCTV versus the Premier League was already sold on some pay TV platform. So but clearly we all know the story now, and that is the Premier League, in my view, was always the one who was, let's call it, the most aggressive in a positive way, coming into Asia with for friendly matches. None of the other leagues, clubs have come anywhere close to it for the last 20 years or beyond. I've been here, but the Premier League clubs have been here and cultivating that following and building that connection with the fan. And I think that's another huge component, of course, why the Premier League is as big as it is now out here, and on the back of it, generates the huge returns there, of course. So, have you ever looked at that a bit? How these tours impact, sharing the gospel around the world?
I mentioned a little earlier, Marcus, about one piece of research that I was involved in, which entailed surveying 12,000 Chinese football fans. That was specifically at a Manchester United tour game in Beijing back in 2005.
Okay.
And there will be some people out there in the world, I'm sure, who will listen to this and know. But what actually happened during that game was United went to play a tour match or a series of tour matches in China, but essentially they played a second 11. So the big stars of the club very often didn't turn out in the starting 11.
Right.
And the Chinese fans really were very, very unhappy about this because, of course, their engagement was very often based upon identification with a star player or with a series of star players. And so they somehow felt betrayed. And for me, the lesson of this was that fans obviously engage with a club for particular reasons. And you can't then renege on that promise, if you like, a brand promise by bringing a bunch of 18-year-olds to play in your starting 11. Yep. And so in terms of moving forward, what that all meant, and I'm thinking particularly here when 4 or 5 years ago, I think Chelsea played in California, and what I recall about that particular tour to California or to the United States and that visit to California is Chelsea sent their players out to a downtown retail outlet for a signing session. And I think this kind of immediacy, you can touch and feel the players. I guess we could call the players their touch and feel goods, if you like, is seeing them online or watching them on TV or having a magazine in which you can look at pictures of them is one thing. Yes. But ultimately they are touch and feel commodities, and so fans do need to see them and to touch them and be with them and to see them perform. And so the lesson, as I say, when you go on tour to China or Japan or wherever else it is that you might go, is don't take a group of second 11 players. You've got to take your very, very best players with you.
Yeah, and I can echo this. I mean, we just had, I was involved in bringing Liverpool and Man United to Bangkok, last summer, here this year. And historically, as a promoter, and I wasn't the promoter, but I was the one who brokered the deal here, you always try to protect yourself, and you try to put a clause in which says you have to bring, so and so and so and so. And of course, the clubs do the opposite, right? They're pushing back and saying, look, we just can't do that. But the answer from both clubs actually was, look, we have a brand reputation to protect, and for us not to show up with our top players, unless there is a very good reason, as the player is injured or something else, of course, happens, why he might not be on the tour. He said, we can't afford it so more because you don't need a clause. Trust me, our reputation is for us more important. And I thought that was a really good way to think of it. And then sort of echoes a bit what you said. I think the clubs in the 20 years ago probably didn't think that way and thought, okay, look, we're still Man United and we'll send a bunch of kids out there and it'd be all fine. And I think they all learned their lessons very quickly. That exactly doesn't work. You need to bring the stars. We didn't have Ronaldo here, but we all know the saga around that, what happened. And, you could somewhat argue that wasn't necessarily the club's fault here. So, it's definitely the case. And I hopefully most clubs in the world have figured that out by now. And of course, rock up with the top guys here. Now, let's move on a little bit into another direction here. So the roles you had, as we touched on last time, you did do some work then, I think, also with the Chinese FA, the Russian FA, a couple of sort of groups in the Middle East, etc. Let's touch on that a little bit because, again, that takes you a bit away from, again, what you're doing just as an academic, but, providing, I guess, expertise on the ground in other parts of the world, right? And your focus, as you like to call it, your Eurasian focus.
So, yeah, I obviously, you've got to keep in mind that I think the world 10 years ago was a very different place to how it is now. And certainly if you look at, the work, for example, that I did in Russia, this was at a time when Putin was very much seen as an ally of the West, right. Particularly in terms of fighting the war on terror, and so it wasn't frowned upon. It wasn't frowned upon to be there. It was much easier to get there, and it was seen as though you were making a contribution to almost to the reformation of a country like Russia. But beyond the kind of current controversies and the reasons for going to such places, I've got a very simple philosophy, which is try not to judge until you've actually been and done something. And so, certainly in terms of going to China for the first time, I think this really, in many ways, it changed my life. It changed my outlook, and then traveling to the Gulf region, it definitely changed my life and changed my outlook. And subsequently, being in Russia, one of the things that struck me about Russia is I think how chaotic it was, and it was a very challenging environment in which to work.
What year was it? Just to give a sense.
So this the first time I was in Russia was kind of 2012, 2013, so not too long before the Sochi Games.
Right.
But I think what this opened my mind up to was the fact that not everybody looked like me and sounded like me and made decisions in the same way as me, and so it did lead me to think about the ways in which we obviously stage sport, we deliver it, the way in which people consume sport. And as we now know, particularly in 2022, with the World Cup impending, but also the likes of Saudi Arabia are investing very, very heavily in sport. I think what I've been able to do is to establish a kind of, if I call it this, a first mover advantage in terms of understanding these countries. And I think to a certain extent, too, with Russia, because we go back to the early part of 2022, and a lot of people seem to have been taken completely off guard by what happened in Ukraine. And we saw, for example, with UEFA and the Champions League, the Gazprom sponsorships. In Formula One, we had the Haas team that suffered as a consequence of its relationship with Russia. And yet, for several years, it's been apparent to me, at least having spent time in Russia, what was happening. And part of my writing over the last 10 years has been talking about kind of motives for the likes of Russia, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, China investing in sport. But I guess as an individual, I now feel I have a much more complex, nuanced, and balanced view of the world. But I guess more importantly, in terms of when I stand in front of classrooms of people who want to become better leaders, better managers, better decision makers in sport, I am now in a position that I wasn't in 20 years ago to be able to say, okay, so here are the things that you need to think about. So, for instance, I was in a classroom very recently in Germany with a group of executive education students, many of them already working in the sport industry. And as I say, what we're able to do is to discuss and to highlight and think about ways of working within some of the challenges that you face in countries like Qatar. And so, bottom line, rather than sitting in my office, contemplating the world, I do like to try and get out and about and to understand and to see and to experience and to speak to people. And I guess ultimately, Marcus, the one thing that I would say is all over the world, no matter where you are, I've met incredibly nice, warm, hospitable, friendly people who, in many cases, they're just trying to make their way through life like the rest of us. But one of the things I hope that I can do is no matter where I am in the world, I've taught in Brazil, I've taught in Japan, I've taught in Denmark, in Norway, I've taught all over the world. Is just hopefully, I hope, is to bring just a little bit more understanding of others, and maybe a little bit more respect, and I hope just a little bit more tolerance for one another. But as I say, in terms of just helping people to become better leaders, better managers, better decision makers in terms of their understanding of the world, that's kind of part of my role, I guess, as an educationalist.
Absolutely. Now let's talk Qatar Supreme Committee. I believe you were a consultant to them for several years, as early as 2012 here, I believe.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. With the World Cup literally a week away now, and by the time this podcast will go out, we'll probably be right in the middle of it, maybe already at the end of it. Let's A, share a little bit what you were doing, and then B, I want, maybe that's how we started, because obviously both Russia and Qatar beat the bids of England and the US, I believe, at that time. So now, being British, I'm sure you would have preferred to have that World Cup at your home turf. Give me a sense of your sentiment on it, and of course then a bit about what exactly you were doing.
So if we go back to 2009, early 2010, which is the first time I ever visited Qatar, it was very clear that something big was already happening. In fact, if you go back to 2006, I think in 2006, the Aspire Sport Academy had first opened up in Qatar, and it was seeing adverts in World Soccer. I'm an avid reader of World Soccer, and seeing adverts for Aspire and thinking, what is that? Football, Football Qatar, Aspire, 2006. What's this all about? So I'd been observing Qatar for some time, and when I went there, as I say, I was somewhat taken aback because the country very clearly was growing rapidly. They were investing in sport. I wasn't particularly aware at that point of what being Qatari meant, or what the Qatari government was really trying to do, or what some of the issues around migrant workers were. One of my abiding memories of Qatar at that very early stage is just how many, and they always used to be in old American school buses. You used to see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of migrant workers in old American school buses. And I never really understood about the labor market in Qatar, about some of the issues around the treatment of migrant workers. But obviously, as the more I went back and the more that I spoke to people, the more I understood what was taking place in Qatar. But I think at one stage, there was a very strong emphasis upon the World Cup providing an educational legacy, not just for Qatar, but for the MENA region more generally, the Middle East and North Africa. So I initially worked with the World Cup organizers on a legacy project, which was essentially about ensuring the delivery of education and research that would help to improve the standard of leadership, decision-making, management within sport and events, as I say, not just in Qatar, but across the Middle East and North Africa more generally.
Right. All right. That's really cool. And so now that, again, you've obviously followed, you were in a sense directly involved, and now you obviously been following what's going on. So let's just stick up to the World Cup for a minute here. And you touched on it, of course, which is the topic of in everyone's, what happened to migrant workers. And I think when we spoke about it last time, we both have a certain opinion about it. It's every single death is sad and tragic. But we also, I think both of us, I think to some degree, if I paraphrase it correctly here, is we also know this wasn't all linked to the World Cup, right? There's hundreds of other projects going on, from shopping malls to whatever, residential buildings coming up, which have absolutely nothing to do with the World Cup, which are part of this, and unfortunately it's all zeroed always into that it's all World Cup, which isn't the case anyway, right? That doesn't make any death better. But what's your thought on that?
And if I say from the outset, my grandfather was a steel worker who's a manual labourer in the local steel works, kind of blue collar working class guy. He died at work, and I think that his employer could have done much more to protect him at work. And so for anybody in Qatar or anywhere else in the world who suffered the loss of a relative at work, I do understand. And my position is very, very simple on this, which is nobody should go to work and die. Nobody.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think that whilst there have been issues in Qatar, and these are well reported, well documented now. Situations like this are never entirely clear in the way that people imagine. And as you say, we're right to make this distinction between those workers who have died on World Cup related projects and those workers elsewhere. Clearly in terms of FIFA and the World Cup organisers, there is a particular set of issues. I think there is another set of issues related to how Qatar in general treats migrant workers and how it gathers statistics about worker deaths. And I think that's a very important point, because one of the things that I've learned about Qatar is its statistical data collection and analysis is not particularly well developed and needs to improve. Clearly there have been some developments. There has been some progress in Qatar, but there needs to be more. And one of the big challenges for not just for the Qataris themselves, but I think for all of us is once the circus leaves town, do we keep the spotlight on some of these issues? Right. But I think we do need to set this in a broader context, and we could keep broadening this context, but I'll try to restrict it. Is many of us, we do enjoy a holiday in Dubai, and we do like going and shopping the Mall of Dubai and in other shopping malls, and those beach holidays that we all know about, and flying on Emirates and the Emirates Airline sponsorships. Very few of us actually question Dubai. Very few of us actually question that sports sponsorship program, and yet a lot of the issues around the Qatar World Cup that we're now talking about are equally as applicable, or were equally as applicable. Yes. During Dubai, and so I think rather than Qatar falling victim to the kind of concerns of the world, we do actually need to be sensible about what's happening, not just in the Gulf region, but across the world in its entirety.
And we can blame the British a little bit, right? I think we spoke about the kafala system, which you explained to me last time.
Yeah, so the kafala system that exists in Qatar in its current form, the British introduced this. I think we've also got to look at the colonial powers of Europe 100 years ago and how they used sport, and so again, I think I'm not here to take sides. I'm not even here to take the side of my own country, the country I was born and brought up in. What I'm here to do is, I hope, and I always try to induce sensible discussions about things that are balanced and open and based on evidence, because I think we're all here together on the planet at the same time. We've got to try and make a decent life together, and if we can address the issues of worker deaths, then absolutely I'm 100% behind that. But as I say, I think sometimes the debate is somewhat skewed and unhelpfully so.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's never quite as black and white as certain groups trying to make it, right? I think that's another way to look at it. But maybe while we have this, let's call it the controversial side of the sports there, let's stick to that for a minute, and the other one, which, what people call sports washing, right? Whether it's a, sovereign nation investing in a football club, again, Qatar obviously owns PSG. Saudi recently bought Newcastle. City is owned by a group out of Abu Dhabi, etc., and so on. And then Saudi have now, of course, spending huge money in golf with the LIV. What's your, let's call it from an academic point of view again? What's your thought on that? How would you look at this, and how do you talk about it in the classroom?
So as with everything, 360-degree view, seen from as many different angles as possible, trying to understand the diversity of standpoints and opinions on particular matters. We can be in no doubt whatsoever across the entire history of sport that being associated with sport carries with it, or brings with it, image and reputational benefits. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that in our 21st century, highly geopoliticized incarnation of sport, that some amongst us label what the likes of Saudi Arabia and others are doing as sport washing. And sport washing in these terms is, essentially trying to distract attention. So instead of seeing the bad stuff about countries, instead, it's used so that we see the good stuff. But again, I take you back to colonial times and the way in which the British used cricket, football, rugby around the world. I guess if the British Empire was still in full flight now, and it was using football, cricket, rugby in the same way, it would be termed sport washing, because the British very clearly were trying to pacify and placate and distract in the context of some of the kind of political challenges that they faced around the world.
History repeats itself in a sense, right?
So yeah, I and you might argue that in terms of national development, some of the issues now being faced by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, were being faced by Britain, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 150 years ago. So, I think there is an interesting debate there potentially around that. But, I think in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and elsewhere, it is not just about image and reputation. It is about deploying sport for policy purposes. And notice I use the word deploy for policy purposes, because I guess if you look at the success of California, which is built on Hollywood and the entertainment industry, but also on the digital economy and like Facebook and others, and so just as we've seen elsewhere in the world, geographic spaces, be it cities, states, countries, developing on the basis of an investment in other forms of industrial activity. So I think that's what we're now seeing in places like Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There's money to be made, there are jobs to be created, there are exports to be delivered as a consequence of being successful or prominent members of the global sporting community. At the same time, there are political benefits too, and certainly in terms of Qatar, I guess prior to the World Cup, most of us maybe didn't even know where Qatar was. There may still be some people out there in the world who don't know where Qatar is, but certainly go back to 2010, before the World Cup bid, most of us would have had some difficulty saying, well, this is who the Qataris are, this is what the country stands for,
Absolutely.
this is what they do, this is how they live their lives, and so sport in political terms, in those political terms, we now know much more about who the Qataris are, what they stand for. We know about Paris Saint-Germain, we know about the World Cup, so I think there is a political dimension there too.
Yeah, and the country I lived in for a very large part of my life, Malaysia. When I first went there, and I would tell friends where I live, they would like, "Where's Malaysia?" Right, and then you say next to Singapore. Okay, then they sort of got a sense. Then Malaysia, started to host the Formula One race, and obviously was a host city for almost 20 years. And very shortly, and I would say within a reasonably short period of time, you didn't have to explain it anymore, right? So, and whether it is F1, of course, or these huge mega events, the World Cups, the Olympics of the world, they can do this, right? And they do it very well for countries to put them on the map, to expose them. If you look at Singapore, what they did with the F1 race, right? It's, people, yes, maybe knew about Singapore, but now you watch them on TV, lit up like a Christmas tree at night. The city looks amazing. That you're going, I might want to go there and have a look, right? Myself is obvious, right? So, and I do, so is it sports washing, or is it simple marketing, PR and other terms, which anyone uses anyway, right? And using sports for it in the right or wrong way. And like I said, we all know that, yes, there are reasons why people have a negative connotation to it, but I do think it's just what it is, right? And sports benefits, of course, on the back of it, and taking those sports around the world. So
and as you know, Marcus, with great brands, great brands don't have to explain who they are and what they do. People instinctively know, and whether we're talking about training shoes or football boots, or we're talking about Paris fashion, particular brands, particular names carry with them associations in people's minds that lead people to behave in particular ways. And what we're now living in the era of is this notion of nation branding. And I think sport for Qatar, sport for Saudi Arabia, sport for Great Britain is an important part of the nation brand. We don't need, whenever I go around the world, I always sit in the front seat of a taxi and talk to the taxi driver about their favourite Premier League team. Is you don't need to explain the English Premier League. It's a great brand. People instinctively know what it's all about. And so, I guess in those terms, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, they want a piece of the action too. And obviously their investments in sport are part of getting that piece of action.
Yep. No, I like that. Nation building is definitely it's the right term, and you see it all over the world, right? And everyone has a different way of using it in a sense. And because the biggest powers in the world, and it goes not just the nations, it's cities, right? The biggest cities in the world are trying to be the host of things. And now I want to talk a bit about China. Another giant in this whole piece of puzzle. Obviously, for a very long time, very again, aggressive in promoting themselves in sports with the Olympics, obviously, right? 2008 was the sort of, shining example. How China arrived on the world stage. Obviously, the most recent Winter Olympics was probably not quite at the same level, or nowhere near at the level, also COVID related. And now you have things which to some degree surprised me. they were supposed to host the Asian Football Confederation, which is the Asia Cup, which is like the Euro for this part of the world here, next year. And they, a few months back, gave it up as the host country, and now it will be in Qatar, interesting enough, which again, maybe not everyone even knows that. So the next Asian Cup will be in Qatar in the end of 2023, again, most likely similar sort of timing. But China obviously did this, and they were proud to win the rights because they wanted to host the World Cup, right? They've made clear 2030, 2034, I think, is when they're trying to go after it. So now China has really shut themselves down for all intents and purposes, not just because of COVID, but also shutting down the borders for events and other things. Everything I see there is how much you see this, and again, from your point of view, what do you see is happening there? Since you also, of course, deal with geopolitics in your classroom here, what's your sort of reading on this?
So I am in my business school. I am the program director for our global executive MBA in sport, which was scheduled to start in Shanghai last September. It's currently scheduled to start in February 2023, next year. So literally on a day-by-day basis, we're trying to understand and to read the political situation in China. Because there is a practical operational concern, which is, we need to run a program. We need to find staff. We've got to get students. We've got to make sure that we're all safe, that we don't breach any Chinese government regulations. And so, I do live this every day. And unfortunately, my simple answer to all of this is nobody really knows what's about to happen. So because of the opaque nature of government and governance in China, even as an institution, or me working for an institution that is on the front line of service provision in China, we really don't know what's going to happen next. And I think for Chinese sport, if you go back to 2015-16 in particular, there was this frenzy around Chinese sport and how it was going to be the world's biggest domestic sport economy, how there were multiple sporting events going to go there. We saw obviously lots of football clubs and other assets being acquired by Chinese investors. And yet it seems now that China has pressed the pause button on everything. In fact, it's probably not the pause button, it's the reset button, because a lot of those investments and opportunities that China had at its fingertips, they've chosen to step back from. So I wish I could tell you something really deep and meaningful, but as I said, I think perhaps the only deep and meaningful thing I can say is with China, you just never ever know what's going to happen next, and that's a reflection of the political system the country has. Yeah,
for sure. Obviously, they recently had the Congress again, and hopefully things are now slowly becoming clearer again. But yeah, I agree. Obviously, I've had offices there and spent many trips and days up there. And it is a complicated country. When China was pushing so hard into football, which was really seemed to be their favorite sport, even though basketball, of course, is equally large in the country. There was always this debate: could China one day be the Chinese Football League be bigger than the Premier League or bigger than European football? And in my mind, it was possible. If you look at the sheer size of the country, why wouldn't it one day, be able to outmuscle everyone else in the process? Obviously, now we know again we're smarter, and it isn't quite as simple as it sounds like. Sheer size isn't all there is to it. It also needs infrastructures and the money, of course, behind it, which has clearly disappeared at the moment. So yeah, we'll keep coming back to that. And again, let us know when you hear new things about it.
I'll try.
The whole sporting world is, of course, somewhat stuck, right? China was a great destination, both from finding sponsors, of course, bringing large events there, and I guess let's see what happens there. Now let's I want to touch on a few more things. You wrote a couple of books, The Business of FIFA's World Cup and the Handbook on Sports Marketing and entrepreneurship, etc. Share a little bit out of this. Maybe some interesting stories. Which came out of these books and how to get them, etc.
So if we go back right back to the origins of when I first started to write about and teach the business of sport in business schools, is there were no resources. There literally weren't any resources. And what resources that were of any relevance were very often North American, and obviously North American sport in terms of salary caps and franchises and tailgating and all the rest of it. That obviously worked for them, but it didn't necessarily work either for a British or a European audience, or for that matter, later on when I started to write about Asia, it didn't work there either. And so I guess this is the kind of, if you can call me a public sector entrepreneur, if that's there is such a phrase. Obviously I was working in public sector institutions, in universities, but nevertheless, I could see that there was an opportunity for people to begin creating the foundations or the basis for a discipline that we now see in many business schools across the world. And of course, there are many private institutions offering education and training in sport as well. So I've always been always been a person really looking out for the next opportunity and for interesting things that are coming down the line, and looking at the kind of big mega trends. And I've been able to do that. And you've mentioned some of the publications that I've been associated with already. Early next year, we have a book coming out through Routledge called The Geopolitical Economy of Sport: Money, Power, Politics, and the State. Nice. And this is, this will be the first book about the geopolitical economy of sport anywhere in the world ever. So, again, first mover advantage. But it's really a response.
I'd like a copy.
Okay, we'll try and fix that for you, Marcus. It's really to account for, just to give you one example, Peng Shuai, when the Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai made her allegations against the government official on social media, and before you knew it, there was a global outcry, and Thomas Bach is online talking to Peng Shuai that somebody took a photograph of, and this was just before the Beijing Olympics. Correct. And there were calls for
the Winter Olympics, right?
Yeah, there were calls for boycotts. There were calls for sponsors to make statements. A really, really kind of big and complex, not just about sport, not even just about business, but also about geopolitics too. And so, this book in particular, I think it's important to me because we're making decisions now in sport, and we're managing in sport. We're trying to be leaders in sport, set against a backdrop of global fractiousness and sensitivity, and so that book hopefully will make a contribution to people understanding the world just a little better. And this has always been my basic philosophy, is to try and read the signs and see what's coming and respond to it, not just through publishing books, but also in terms of writing shorter pieces of shorter articles for various outlets. And of course, kind of core business for me is
and doing
being
podcasts.
able to doing podcasts, but also sitting with students and saying, hey students, what are we thinking, what happens next? Because I guess one of the things, Marcus, that we've got to say is many of the people that you and I know, and many of the people that we've worked with at one time were university students, and so I want to make sure that I can make a contribution to ensuring the next generation of leaders and managers, that they do have a better understanding of the world into which they're gonna work.
Absolutely. And to be honest, that is exactly the reason I'm doing the podcast, and the philosophy behind it is that education, which yes, you can read in books and or go study if you have the resources and the ability to do it. But podcast is a simple way to listen, learn from experts like yourself and others who have obviously had on this here, over 80 by now, which is hundreds and hundreds of man hours or man years of lessons and learning here. And obviously it's like a mini MBA in itself. Not that I'm trying to compete with you or others in the same space, but yeah, that is definitely the same logic behind it. And I'm great to see all these great books which you're bringing out. And I think Routledge is, as you mentioned, is the publisher. So we'll make sure that is in the podcast notes as well. So anyone who's interested for some of the books that you have done already, and of course the one that's coming out, where to find it, which I think is fantastic, really interesting. Now you mentioned, you like focusing on sort of the hot topics, and the new things, and of course one is for sure women in sports, right? And I believe you're also a trustee in an organization there, and so let's talk about that for a minute here. We all know the equality and all the other buzzwords which are out there. And in some sports, women are as right up there as men are anyway, right? If you pick tennis or other sports where clearly, watching the women players as much as the men players, in terms of prize money, there's also, parity in anyways. But then there's other sports where clearly are, let's call them, they're somewhat male dominated. And recently you had the story about the motorsports series, which was focused on women. I can't remember the name of it, I have to admit. But they obviously running in some problems and running a bit out of money. Football now, women's football is taken on. The Euro was very successful in your home country there. Again, share a little bit about what your thought is on it, and where do you see women's football, women's sports going? What's the opportunities and what's the challenges they're facing?
So I used to be a director of research for and a trustee of Women in Sport. I no longer have these positions. I found this a very interesting experience, and interesting because I was one man on a board who sat on a board consisting completely of women, and I felt honoured to be able to do that. But I also felt that I was able to learn a huge amount from this situation, because the kinds of issues that this group of women was talking about really, as a man, hadn't previously occurred to me. And I think what I now know is it's very easy to say, well, women's sport should be equal to men's sport, and I fully support equality and everything that goes along with that. But it's very easy for men to make such statements, because I think that there are obstacles and hurdles that from a very, very early age, females face that men don't. And for example, just to give you one example, and when I first was sat in on a conversation like this, obviously when a girl reaches puberty, things happen to her, both physically and mentally, I think, that really influence engagement with sport, and issues around body image and willingness to participate in sport when faced with other alternatives. And so I think I do believe that I'm a big egalitarian in every respect, and my view is that females and males together, whether it's delivering sport, participating in sport, consuming sport, there should be absolute parity in all of this. But as I say, I think really what people have to understand, particularly men, is that these words can very often come easy and without necessarily the understanding of what's going to take us to equality. And it's not always just simply saying, well, award equal prize money, or make sure that men and women get equal attention on TV. There are issues, challenges, obstacles that women and women's sport face that men and men's sport don't. Sure. And so I think part of my role as an educator is to talk about such things when I'm with leaders and future leaders and managers.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's an important part of this.
And I think the part we also have to somewhat, and it's to remember, is it is still driven by the market itself too, right? I mean, we can all say it should be all equal, but if the revenue streams in sports, which is TV money, sponsorship, is all the other stuff, if that is still currently very heavily skewed in a particular area, that is, as a Formula One in motorsports and the Premier League on one side, just because there is an equivalent version of that now for women, that doesn't mean all the dollars will flow there, right? Because obviously the interest isn't there, the sponsorship dollars therefore don't go tag along right away, right? And so I think, in my view, is always we need to be somewhat conscious of that it still has to make some commercial sense when we pushing these agendas, right? Everyone loves. I have a daughter, so yes, I love the equality side of things here. And give girls as much of a chance as boys in a sense, but there is someone has to pay for it, right? And you can clearly see that it isn't always as simple as it sounds like, right?
Yeah. What worries me is that certainly in Britain we've got really what appears to be rapidly changing attitudes to women's sport, and I hope that that is genuine and authentic. and consistent and sustainable, because I just do worry a little bit that it's kind of this year's thing,
bit of lip service,
and next year, next year's thing will come along, and people will tend to forget, and so. I think there does need, I've used the words there, kind of genuine and consistent, authentic, sustainable, and moving forward from here, it is about taking those, kind of core values or core principles, and keeping in mind that there are obstacles that women and girls face that men and boys don't, and really recognizing that, hey, come on. This is 50% of the population. The world just doesn't consist of men. Females can constitute 50% of the population, and I'll let everybody into a big secret here. They have jobs and they earn money and they buy things, and so they're in terms of making women's sport pay. I think we have to realise that women don't necessarily consume in the same way as men, and so the kind of relationships that they have with brands or with different forms of sport and the way they consume that sport, it's different to men. And so again, I think one of the things as far as the industry is concerned is we don't just extrapolate outwards from well, this is what men do, so women probably do that as well. We do have to make a commitment to genuinely understanding women's sport and to delivering the kinds of outcomes that are not just going to make women's sport this year's thing, but ultimately you're going to make a tangible contribution to the long-term health of women's sport.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's well said. Now I want to touch a couple more things as we're sort of starting to wrap things up a bit here. And one is again, how much do you look at the world of esports? Obviously being again a buzzword for several years now, and even more, of course, during COVID. How much is that already sort of coming in, and you sort of trying to draw parallels in the classroom, and or how much are the students asking about it and saying, look, we want to talk about that as well? But give me some sense.
Well, in simple terms, I'm from a generation that I guess esports kind of passed us by, certainly passed me by, and so I'm not a gamer, and what I'm really acutely aware of is we've got a new generation of academics entering university education who were gamers and have a passionate interest in esports, and so I can't run fast enough to compete with these people. So there are great people out there across the world doing this, looking at the business of esports. But I guess from a personal standpoint, as a professional, what particularly interests me, and I've written a little bit about, is how countries seek to achieve competitive advantage through an investment in esports. And immediately South Korea and Denmark spring to mind for me, because both have national government policy, national government strategy focused on promoting and developing the esports industry. And this is not just getting lots and lots of people playing it, but inevitably there is a hardware industry underpinning this, but there's also a software industry underpinning this. And so as a business school guy, I'm thinking, okay, esports, government strategy, money, jobs, tax revenues, contribution to gross domestic product, exports, and so on and so forth. And we have another country, and we've mentioned this country already, Saudi Arabia.
Yes, of course.
Which the barriers to entry for Saudi Arabia, particularly if we're thinking about football and being globally successful in football, are significant. Whereas in esports, much less so. The barriers to entry for Saudi Arabia are lower. And so what we now see is that the Saudi Arabian government is committing substantial resources to esports, not just in terms of creating venues and competitions in the country itself, but also investing in relevant companies overseas that are creating games, that are manufacturing hardware. And so do I play Grand Theft Auto? Do I play Battlefield? No, I don't. But what I do take a very, very keen interest in is for example, the China's staging of League of Legends, for example, which, in terms of economic and political significance and the influence and role that the government plays, is really, really important.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think a lot of what we already said earlier of let's call what I always call regular real sport or traditional sport, you can kind of match and mirror in the world of esports as well, right? Again, like you said, there's ways to use this global power for it. You building brands. Obviously, you mentioned Saudi buying ESL and merging it with Faceit, creating this huge company on the back of it. Most of the other a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries have their own policies as well. And again, everyone is very heavily, has policy to track that and become the next big hub. China is the single largest esports or gaming country on the planet by bar none, even though they throttled it down again, as China does in many ways, with restricting play. Again, some people would have read that, which really surprised me, I have to admit. But still, the market is, as a single market, by a mile the biggest, even bigger than the US. So it's and Asia by itself is really on the forefront of it. Much more probably on the mobile side of it. We own a couple of esports teams here now as well, and as you said, the entry point is just easier, right? We're not talking millions right away to start a football club, but you can do it for hundreds of thousands, and and build it from there. But I've seen it now, obviously coming from the traditional world of sports marketing for 25 years. And now, I don't know, let's say 5, 6 years, 7 years I've been in esports as well, or gaming as well. There's so much similarities in it. And I love that part. I love how, you can really learn, or the best things the lessons you've learned from before, you can, copy it here. So, it's an exciting space. And I'm sure more of that we'll be discussing in the future here. Now, so maybe on my last question to sort of wrap it up here, is your thoughts on sports during COVID and now coming out of it, right? And let's hope, for argument's sake, that it is truly over in 23 and we're all finally back to normal. In some parts of the world is already the case, but we already mentioned earlier, China isn't quite there yet, right? Still has very large restrictions, and a few other countries do. How do you talk about this in the classroom, and what is it what you see, how sports, maybe some example of sports which did really well reacting to it and others much less, and now of course how they're coming out of it, and the new normal for sports around the world.
So I think COVID for me, as we went into it, I wrote a couple of pieces and was interviewed several times by members of the global media, and I said, well, survival of the fittest.
Right. Yeah,
and
sure.
What we now see is some of those bigger sports in the world, bigger in terms of global reach, in terms of numbers of fans and consumers, and in terms of their revenue streams. Obviously, there was a little bit of a bump in the road initially when they tried to get used to the realities of COVID, but subsequent to that, I mean, we've seen figures recently from Manchester City, we've seen figures from likes of Paris Saint-Germain, and hey, the strong survived. I think it's further down kind of professional pyramids, professional structures of competitions and leagues and so forth, and maybe some of the less popular sports that have really struggled to adapt and struggled to respond. And I know there are a lot of organizations out there really financially are not in great shape right now. Right. And so we do have this polarization of the world of sport. And we now know, obviously, football continues to be very strong. Formula One has long been a global proposition, but on the back of digital technology, particularly Netflix and its Drive to Survive series, we're seeing really quite amazing business being done around Formula One and new markets, new consumers.
Yep.
Obviously,
finally captured the American market. I think,
a very different operating. I'm a long time, as we discussed right at the very start of the podcast. I'm a long time observer of Formula One, and I remember back in the old days of the 1970s and 80s, where really, the United States and Formula One didn't love each other at all, yep. And it was a failed venture in many ways. But right. They've got a very a new relationship. So as I say, I see in many cases what is happening in sport is very similar to what's happened in food and beverage globally, what's happened in terms of airlines globally, what's happened with digital services and in the IT sector across the globe, which is that essentially industries tend to ultimately be concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number. And as I say, if football is very dominant, but then if you look inside football, obviously you've got certain teams from certain countries dominant,
Right.
and so this form of industrial concentration seems to be a reality of economic life for the world. And the question is, how do you respond to that? Do you seek to break that industrial concentration, or do you let it happen, and do you satisfy yourself with it? And
Right.
I think throughout the pandemic has just exacerbated that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, and for sure, the big brands always seem to get bigger, but that's in the real world as well, right? No one's going to ever challenge Coke and Pepsi probably in this space, right? Or very unlikely. So, it's an interesting one. Now, one last question did sort of come up, then, which I definitely want to touch on, and that is, of course, again, sort of global recession and what's happening around the world, or what many believe is going to be happening here. And again, so when you study, and then doing all this research, you're looking at one thing which I thought is really interesting is in the last probably at least 3-4 months, you've seen more very large TV deals being cut around the world than I've seen in a very long time. Right. And in an environment which the rest of the world is we have huge inflation, we have, also the issues going on around the world. We have a war in Russia, Ukraine there, etc. And then you see the largest, NFL deal ever. The IPL in India signed a massive new TV deal. Certain deals in Australia were just renewed for huge sums. US for sure stood out with several other deals. MLS doing a deal with Apple, etc. I mean, there's just, you name it. There's a very long list of mega deals being cut for, in some cases, 8, 9, 10 years into the future, and others are obviously slightly shorter. But it's just unique how sports sort of, sometimes is counter-cyclical to what the rest of the world is doing, right? And how stock, prices have fallen of some of the biggest companies like Facebook, etc. So how do you explain that to anyone? What would be your sort of view on that from both academic and your own experiences?
I guess in very simple terms, number one, sport has a global power that arguably other forms of consumption and other industrial sectors don't. And I think we should take heart from this as people working within the industry. Right. But as I say, I think at the same time, the fact that we are getting big money deals linked to big money sports in countries that have got either mature sport economies or rapidly growing sport economies, kind of bears out what I was saying earlier about this industrial polarization, because it's very easy to point to these big deals in big sports in big countries and say, look, sport is healthy, sport is strong. But as I say, elsewhere in the world, sure, sports and leagues and competitions are struggling, and those kinds of deals are not evident. So yes, sport is powerful. Yes, I think it takes brands, it takes broadcasters, it takes products to people and places that other industrial sectors can't. But as I say, I still do believe that we live in this very polarized world. That's a characteristic generally of our world at the moment. And for every big money deal, I think there are lots of other deals that are far less big money, and there are many organizations that are struggling.
Yep. No, I think, and I would agree with that as well. And definitely polarization, whether it's in politics or in other ways, is probably the word of 2022 and 23 here. So, Simon, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed this. I could keep going here, but I'm also conscious of time.
I know I've got to go and eat some lunch because I've then got another meeting coming up. So
cool. Thank you for sharing all this, and I really this was great fun, and hopefully we'll do it again soon. So have a great day in Paris.
Thank you very much, and when you're ready to go, let me know, and I'll share.
Definitely, we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Marcus. Cheers. See you.
Thanks. Bye.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.